Boston did not benefit from many years ago. And with us that is attorney Richard Betstein. Richard is with the Betstein Law Group, and he also contributes to a real estate blog called Massachusetts Real Estate Law Blog, and I read a piece that he wrote today, actually, rent control coming to a Boston rental property near you. So let me, first of all, welcome Attorney Betstein. How are you, Richard, tonight? Welcome.
Hey, Dan, how you doing? Good to be here.
Just to kind of run this out, there's no formal proposal yet, as I understand it, but the mayor, when these stories are in the newspapers, it's pretty clear that she's ready to do this. Rent control was big back in the 1970s, but I think it was considered by many to be a miserable failure across the country. What is the background? Is my history off base on that?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely correct. It was in place in Boston, Brookline, Cambridge, and in place through about the mid-90s. 1994, we went up to a statewide vote, a referendum, and statewide, the voters voted to get rid of rent control entirely. So the only way that any municipality can now get rent control back on the books is to do what's called a home rule petition, and that's essentially what Mayor Wu is trying to do right now. Again, haven't seen the details of the proposal, what devil's in the details, but it looks like she's going around and starting to do the process with the stakeholders, tenants, and landlord groups and whatnot. But
my memory might be a little distant here, but I think it's pretty good. I believe that one of the beneficiaries of rent control in Cambridge was a state Supreme Court justice who had lived in her apartment. It was, I understand, a beautiful apartment right on Memorial Drive on the Charles River for a long time, and was paying some insanely low rent in Cambridge. Do you recall who I'm talking about?
Yeah, no, I mean, I recall that. Anecdotally, I was talking to my parents tonight, and they were saying someone in the family or a distant relative of the family, had a rent control apartment and was like, she's never going to give it up, and I think she qualified for it. But that's part of the problem. It creates an incentive system where you're gonna hold on to something, this apartment for life. And one of the flaws of the whole system is that it actually really discriminates against prospective renters, young folks who actually want to get into their first apartment and can't, because you have basically all these folks that are hoarding rent control apartments.
And again, I'm not going to mention her name, but I think she was one of the Massachusetts State Supreme Court justices at the time, if you recall. And if you don't recall her name, that's fine. I don't want to go there. But the idea was that she had a very sweet deal.
I'm not sure how she was able to qualify given her salary.
I think a lot of it was grandfathered in, and sometime when I'm talking to you privately, I'll recall it for you. And as a matter of fact, I'll probably Google it here and confirm it. But the idea was that someone in a position of, influence was benefiting from this program, and the idea was that the taxes, the real estate taxes that the owners of these apartments were paying, there was no control on those costs. There was no control on the costs that the owners were paying for maintenance and for upkeep. And yet the only thing that was controlled was the rent that could be charged. And it just seemed inherently unfair. And I think that's why voters in Massachusetts voted it out in 1995.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, it's worse than unfair. I mean, what it does is it essentially create subsidized housing on the backs of private property owners. So, I mean, and I know people throw out the word socialism and communism and all that a lot, but it actually, it is very close to just kind of classic socialism in that the government is coming in and setting a complete price control. And, for those of us that, went to college and studied economics, I mean, even going back to Milton Friedman in the 1940s, and that was one of the first analysis of rent control, and he said, as with any kind of government price control, it just, especially with something like housing, it doesn't work. It might appeal to someone in the short term. A lot of these renters are going to be, oh, great, my rent doesn't go up for, it only goes up 2% a year, 3% a year, whatever it is. But over time, put yourself in the landlord position. What am I going to do now? What's going to motivate me to do now that my income stream is going to be essentially, shut down or would only increase very little? Am I going to spend $10,000 to put in, a new dishwasher, a new stove, granite countertops? No, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to spend the least amount of money possible because my margins are low. And then what am I going to do on the tenant side? I'm going to look for the absolute best tenant, highest credit, highest employment type of tenant possible. And it actually has been proven, the studies out of Cambridge in particular, that rent control is actually racist. It actually has a disparate impact on minorities and others, depressed socioeconomic people, because exactly what I described is the landlords are essentially picking the higher qualified, and they're not selecting the folks with the lower credit scores, and we know how unfair the credit scores can be against people of color. So,
by the way, I have Googled as we spoke, and I'm correct. This is out of the Harvard Crimson, the day after the vote in 1995. And the headline of the story was "Rent Control Headed for Defeat" on November 9th in the Harvard Crimson, and it mentions Cambridge Mayor Kenneth Reeves lives in a rent control department, as does State Supreme Judicial Court Justice Ruth Abrams, and so
oh wow,
yeah, and so it just shows that oftentimes the people who benefit from rent control when it is installed or is implemented are people who are well connected, and it's not necessarily going to benefit the people at the lowest end of the rung, lowest rung on the ladder, I should say. My guess.
Right. And then you might remember the rent control boards. We have these, another layer of bureaucrats that they were in Boston, they were in Cambridge, they were in Brookline, and again, with any type of very bureaucratic agency, it's rife for corruption or bribes or favors and
or just favoritism
that we see.
You don't have to have a quid pro quo. It's just simple favoritism. My guest is attorney Richard Betstein. He is with the Betstein Law Group and is very much involved in these issues, has argued some very high-profile cases dealing with these issues. And Mayor Wu is talking about basically annual increases on rent that in Boston could be anywhere from 6 to 10%. There would be a cap at 10%, so it's not. It is capped, but that's they would be capped from anywhere from between 6 and 10%, and that is not pure rent control. I mean, it's not as if they're saying there will never be increased, but it still is something that I think interferes with the regular market mechanisms. And we'll take phone calls. If you're a proponent of it, if you've benefited from it in the past, fine. 617-254-1030, 888-929-1030, and we'll be back on Nightside. Also, the other line, which often people don't take advantage of, is 617-931-1030. Back on Nightside, talking about rent control. Is it coming to Boston soon? Well, it may. We'll be back on Nightside.
It's Nightside with Dan Ray.
Hey, Dan. My guest is Richard Betstein, an experienced real estate attorney with the Betstein Group. Richard, explain to us as you understand it, and I realize nothing is on the table, but both Boston newspapers have written about it. You wrote about it today. Give us a practical example of rent control, in your opinion, as envisioned by Mayor Wu, would be. Just give us some numbers that people can understand.
Yeah, so the numbers that I saw are the first kind of major factor is a cap on rental increases, and that would be anywhere between a cap of 6% to 10%, and it depends on the current consumer price index, CPI, and this inflation index, which I'm not sure where that's coming from. That's kind of a new one, given that we're in the inflationary environment. So basically, you're capped out at the low point at 6% and at the high point at 10%. So, let's say you have, your lease is $1,000 a month.
Yep.
Your tenant is going to be up for renewal, or the lease is going to terminate and you want to renew. And here's the problem. And it's when the rents are already a bit under market. And I actually had some clients today call me and said, hey, listen, I just, read about Michelle Wu, and, my rent's under market, and, I want to get a jump on this. So, I'm going to raise the rent by 20% this year, because I want to beat this essentially to the market.
Yeah.
I had like 3 calls today on just that. So, you're already seeing a reaction to this, but let's just say that, you're the basic landlord, and then now you're stuck. Now, it looks to be, when does it end? It's not clear. Is this in perpetuity? Again, not clear. Does it survive, tenants who come after? I don't know. Is someone stuck with, a cap at 6% for 50 years? It just seems nutty. And people might say, 6% is like, that's plenty for the landlords. There's a lot of landlord bashing. They already make too much money and blah, blah, blah. But, look, are you happy on your stock market portfolio at 6%? Landlords have, they have to pay real estate taxes. They have to pay for upkeep. They have to pay for insurance.
Well, look how much electric and gas bills have increased just this winter.
Yeah, exactly. And, you got water and sewer. You got capital improvements. And you got, then you have, situation. Again, coming off of COVID and what we saw, and again, thank you for mentioning, I handled the eviction moratorium cases, and I'm in housing court, literally, almost every other day. I've handled over 5,000 evictions, and I had a client just a few weeks ago that take a $30,000 rental loss, and for whatever reason, rental systems wasn't in play. And this is happening all across the state. And now it's like, we're going to kind of add insult to injury coming off COVID and say, well, we're going to essentially prevent you from, making money, which I hate to say it, but this is the system that has been created, intentionally by the government. We're a free market economy. The private housing is 90% of the housing stock. So, if you're going to artificially adjust the pricing, then there has to be some type of government subsidy in play. Otherwise, again, you're creating a socialist system, which is completely unfair.
By the way, on just a different topic for a moment, I'm probably going to be back in touch with you next week. We're doing a case that the Pacific Legal Foundation has is bringing to the U.S. Supreme Court. I guess there are 11 states around the country, including Massachusetts, and I was unaware of this, that if people are in arrears with their property tax.
Real estate taxes. Yeah.
Real estate taxes. We're talking about individual homeowners here.
Yeah, I heard. Is this one with the elderly lady, right?
This is the woman out in New Bedford.
Yeah.
Apparently, I guess was in arrears for about $9,000 in real estate taxes, which is a lot of money. Fair enough. Okay. And apparently, the city of, I think it's New Bedford, put a lien on her property. Then they sold the lien to a private company. which was able to, I guess, collect on the lien, and the lien had increased with penalties and interest to $30,000. So now it's a substantial amount of money. And my understanding is that the private company was then able to take her property, which was worth about $240,000, and she ended up without a dime. The city got their their gallon of their pound of flesh, $30,000, but this private company, in conjunction with the city, the private company walked away with $210,000. I had never heard of anything like that, and yet apparently this exists, and it's being done in some of the major cities here in Massachusetts and in 11 other states around the country. Had you heard of that?
Yeah. I mean, the answer is yes. I don't know the exact details on the Supreme Court case, but I know
it hasn't been argued. The Supreme Court is there's a leading national case which would affect this woman. Her case is not going up, but a companion case has been granted cert. So go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no. I mean, I've heard of these kind of companies. It's like tax lien foreclosure racket with these kind of, they're no different than these kind of scammy credit counseling type outfits, but they go around and they buy these debts on pennies on the dollar. And again, the problem, and I think what the Supreme Court is going to look at are what the procedural due process protections are. Obviously, when you're depriving someone of property, there has to be sufficient notice and hearing and opportunity to test and all that stuff. And I just had a case dismissed because of service. Because in Massachusetts, you can still serve a lawsuit for millions of dollars against an out-of-state company via certified mail.
No personal service necessary.
Exactly. Yeah. So this case was going. 3 years went by, and my client, a company out of Texas, they were like, "We're never served," and the judge actually dismissed it and said, you don't know who signed this. It's a large building. So, yeah, I mean, that's still in the book. So and this Supreme Court, I think we talked about that, for the show. Obviously you have a very conservative court, and they took a hard look at the eviction moratoriums. They struck down the CDC. I believe they struck down New York, or they entered an injunction. That thing went away. And there's some other cases where we're kind of seeing a renaissance or a reemergence of a very hard look at a lot of these kind of governmental interference with property rights, takings and procedural due process and all that stuff.
We'll have to see. Let me do this if I could. We got to take a quick break here. My guest is attorney Richard Betstein, and I took the opportunity to ask you about this because you know a lot more about this than I do, and I was just appalled by it. So we're going to go to phone calls after the break and see what people have to say about this. Should rent control come back to Boston? Whatever your point of view is, feel free to join the conversation. My guest is a longtime real estate attorney, Richard Betstein, and he's talking about this proposal that Mayor Wu has not formally presented, but certainly there's been enough conversations that both newspapers have pretty much focused down on what they think that proposal will be. Coming up at 10 o'clock tonight, we will change topics and talk about the charges against Alec Baldwin in that shooting case on the set of the movie Rust in New Mexico. We'll be back with my guest, Richard Betstein, and your phone calls on Nightside right after this news break. Rent control in Boston, and your questions, your comments are welcome. My guest, who is an expert in this area, has spent his entire legal career, or most of his legal career, Richard Betstein of the Betstein Group. Let's go to phone calls, Richard, if you're ready.
Sure thing.
Okay, Steve is in Cambridge. Steve, welcome first tonight on Nightside on this topic.
Dan and Richard. In Cambridge, at the time of rent control, there was no means testing, and I believe the president or the vice president of WGBH also lived in a rent-controlled apartment.
Was that David Ives at the time, if I'm not mistaken?
I don't remember the name.
Okay, fair enough. Okay.
But some people thought that rent control should be, or tenants should be subject to means testing. But I wondered if Richard, means testing usually means people either have a disincentive to work and keep their income low, or they either hide assets. I wonder what Richard feels about that.
Yeah, I actually had a conversation with the executive director of Mass Landlords today, leading trade group, and he said that he didn't see a means test in what was floated out there, and that was one of his big issues. So obviously, you know, if this rent control ordinance and 6 to 10% cap is on almost every single rental property, there are a few exceptions for owner occupied, but if it's kind of a citywide thing, then I mean, that's just going to have an incredibly disastrous impact. I mean, the nature of the remedy, I mean, it's supposed to increase affordable housing. So, you know, affordable housing is for people who can't afford housing by definition. So it should go to, you know, people at a lower income level, you would think. But
well, I would think that when you introduce a means test, that doesn't always mean lower income people get in. It means that they are good at hiding their assets, or they have a disincentive to find work. I mean, I know people who are in public housing who would never think of getting a job, because if they get a job, that means they're going to have to pay more rent, and so they have no interest in finding a job.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the way, you know, Section 8 works right now. You know, it's obviously, it's at 30% of income or 34 or whatever it is. Yeah, no, I mean, if, you know, someone who's right at that, you know, I'm making 50,000, or now I'm going to get a jump up to 65,000, and it's like, is that worth it? Is it worth it to take $15,000 more? And oftentimes with Section 8, they'll say, no, it's not worth it. So yeah, I agree with you 100%.
I assume in some cases people might lose their eligibility for certain levels of subsidized housing if they earn more money than is permitted.
Or if they work, period. If they don't work, then they don't pay any rent. If they work, they pay a third of their income to rent. So there's a disincentive to work. My last comment is...
America is a great country, though, Steve, don't you think?
There's no question about that. My last comment is, though, I mean, I knew someone in Cambridge who was living in rent-controlled housing in Cambridge, so he was paying way below market rate. And he owned a home in Somerville where there wasn't rent control, and he was charging his tenants in Somerville market rate.
That is what's called the best of both worlds, Steve.
Isn't it? Isn't it? Gentlemen, thank you. Very interesting discussion.
Yeah. Go ahead. Hey, Richard wants to make a comment. Go ahead, Richard.
No, I was just going to say, interestingly, you know, Mayor Wu is a rental property owner herself. You know, she has that. I think it came up in the campaign. I think she has. I believe she has. There was reported she has rental property.
You mean like in her own house, or she has property separate and apart from her own house?
I thought she had separate property. I could be wrong, but I thought she did.
Yeah, well,
or maybe that was Diana Presley. One of them. Anyways.
One more thing. We had rental property. We had small landlords here who might own a triple decker, and they lived in it, so they were under rent control. If you live in a triple decker, no, if they don't live in a triple decker, they own it, but they could rent. And they had tenants who really had more money than them, but they couldn't charge their tenants market rate because of rent control, and the tenants had more money than the landlords.
Well, again, there's no big supporters of the concept of rent control on our panel right now, Steve. We'll see what the other callers have to say. Okay.
Thank you again, gentlemen.
Thank you, Steve. Appreciate it.
Thank
Steve is one of my best callers out of Cambridge. We do have callers out of Cambridge, actually, who are good. Let's go to Dan in Bridgewater. Dan, you're next on Nightside with my guest, attorney Richard Betstein. Go right ahead.
Good evening to the two of you. Actually, the last caller pretty much, brought up what my main issue was that the fact that, myself, for a short period of time, I was actually, in a position where I was renting to a number of different people. And before, during the show, he was talking about, this going to the best of the best and best of credit rating, best of, employment, everything else. But in reality, a lot of times it's the opposite, because I know that the other gentleman mentioned, subsidized housing and things like Section 8, but even though, as far as a third of, your income, that's mostly going for, the project. But people that are on Section 8 housing, those are the ones that you actually look for, because the money doesn't even come from the tenants themselves. It's literally deposited directly into your account on a monthly basis.
Yeah.
So you never have to worry about.
It's predictable. The federal government is predictable and dependable. Yeah.
Exactly. And you never have to worry about it, because one of the biggest issues I had, you don't know when a tenant's going to have an injury. Relationships build between you and the tenant where it feels as if it's, becomes more of a friendship than, tenant landlord relationship type of thing, or you let the person slide for a couple of months, and those things all add up. So honestly, one of the things that I didn't hear a lot of as far as with the rent control was Section 8 housing people, because they can go to any apartment they want, and literally, I have one person right now that's living in a 2-level townhouse and is paying something like $100 out of her own pocket, but she's getting $1,400 a month from the government that's just being put right into the landlord's pocket. And he's the happiest person he could possibly meet.
And that would be you.
Well, it wouldn't be me right now, but I'm hoping it'll be me at some point in the future. There's.
Okay, let me get a comment from Richard on this perspective. Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, so I just Googled it. It says there's approximately 68,000 mobile Section 8 vouchers in all of Massachusetts. So yeah, these are people who see mobile, like they have the voucher and then they can take it anywhere they want. Yeah, so that's statewide. And obviously there's, in terms of housing units, it's millions. So, it's a very small percentage. But I get what you're saying. Some landlords think Section 8's an attractive situation because of the guaranteed money, but the flip side is, the leases are very strict and tough. It's much harder to evict a Section 8 tenant. They often, are there for a much longer time. It's harder to raise the rent, or really near impossible almost. So it comes with, kind of the cost benefit.
It comes with its own. It does have its own downfalls. I will admit that.
Yeah.
But one thing
when it
that
comes to rent control. Yeah, I'm sorry. Rent control. Rent control would not apply to a Section 8 lease, as far as I know and I've seen, because it's already subsidized. So, there's these rent control would be applying to all the private housing, all the the triple deckers in Dorchester and Brighton, and double deckers potentially, as long as they're not owner occupied, the big buildings, everywhere.
So literally, you had just said that they can take them anywhere. So if that passes, you're saying that they couldn't take them to Cambridge?
No, what I'm saying is that I think the rent control ordinance wouldn't apply to that lease. In other words,
I see what you're saying. So it would just be null and void altogether.
yeah, it just wouldn't apply.
I
Because
gotcha.
essentially,
All right,
with
Jane,
Section
you
8,
got it. I got
it's
Pat
almost a
lines.
form of rent control.
All right,
Yeah.
Dan, I want to get one more in here before the break. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you again.
Good night. Let me go to Jane in Gloucester. Jane, you're next on Nightside
Hey,
with my guest
Hi.
attorney, Richard Betstein. Go ahead, Jane.
thank you. So I'm going to make one real quick comment about the topic that you're going to have in another week, where the woman is being lost everything, basically.
Yes.
Okay. There's another aspect of that when you explore that more. In that my ex's mother died, and she had been deferring, which you're allowed to do, and it seemed the godsend at the time, for property taxes for like 10 years.
Yeah.
The hidden flaw in that is that the interest rate in the town she's in is 18%.
Oh, yeah, it's like a credit card interest rate. I get that. Yep.
Exactly.
But do me a favor, save this for next week, okay? Because, Jane, I don't want to be rude to my guest tonight, okay? I opened that can of worms, but I'd appreciate it if you'd call in next week when we have that guest on. As a matter of fact, I can actually tell you that if I can find it here, it will be next. Don't have the date. You're a regular listener. You'll hear it. I think it's next Tuesday night. I'm not sure on that, but we'll get that. I promise. Okay.
At any rate, on this particular thing, I actually lived in a rent control apartment briefly, and it was a kind of a sleaze because I didn't realize it at the time that I was subletting. And the reason I was subletting was because the guy didn't want to give up the apartment, and he was a pretty good rent, obviously. So that's another little angle that shouldn't even be happening. I also worked on rent stabilization in New York, and which is more like the shape that we're talking about. Here, where you talk about 6 to 10%, I also own an apartment in California, which my brother and I own them, and I had to borrow money in a couple of months to pay my mortgage because there is the concept is COLA based, and you have to go to the rent. You were talking before. You have to go to the rent control board if anything gets up, like if gas and electric start to go up. You have to go defend that in front of the rent control board. And so what Mr. Richard is saying is that you have this bureaucracy formed. So you now have to take your petition for the increase in the rent to the board, and then you go back and forth on that, and it costs money, and then takes time, and you're still in March. So the current situation, and then that's the end of this, is that tenant who moved into that rent control apartment almost 15 years ago, and it got to the rent control apartment in a kind of a bad way itself. But now he had bought a house up in wine country, and he wants me to do some upgrades in the apartment. And then I'm like, what? And then they're not some health and safety things. So it's just like I've seen this. I'm a threefer. I've seen these in all different. I don't support them, obviously.
All right. Thank you much, Jane. We'll talk to you next week. Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye.
Appreciate it. Let's keep rolling here. We'll take a quick break. Right back on Nightside with my guest attorney Richard Betstein, and we are previewing what we believe Michelle Wu will be suggesting for rent control in Boston in the not too distant future.
Nightside with Dan Gray on WBZ, Boston's.
I'm here. My guest is Richard Betstein, real estate attorney, who's very concerned about the prospect of rent control arriving in Boston. Let me go next to John in Boston. John, got to be quick for me because we're getting tight on time. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, okay. I just wanted to say, as my history teacher had said, you start out in life, you get yourself an apartment, all of a sudden you're in favor of rent control. Then a few years go by, you got some money, you buy yourself an apartment building, all of a sudden you're against rent control. That's how it goes. But I just wanted to ask, we have the minimum wage, which is price fixing. What is really the difference between the minimum wage and rent control? That puts a pressure on business. They have to raise their prices. And just want to say, when I was a kid, we were told, don't be jumping around. The dirty old landlord, he'll come up and get you. He was dirty, he was old, and he was the landlord. 2 strikes against him. So, there you go. And this is better all of a sudden, everybody wants high wages and low prices, but there's a spiral of wages go up, prices go up.
Yeah.
Okay, let me listen.
Economics 101. All right, thanks, John. Appreciate your call. We go next to JJ in Winchester. JJ, next on Nightside. Go right ahead.
Yes, thanks, Dan, for getting ahead of this, even though the mayor has not, put it up yet. But
well, that is getting ahead of it by definition. We're getting tight on time, JJ. What's your question?
So this is my question, because it seems like if she does get this up for a vote, how would it actually get? Like, how would she actually get it? Would it be on the ballot or something?
No. It passed the city council. She signs it. Then they go home rule petition. They got to get the state legislature, the House and Senate to give Boston the right to have rent control. And then Governor Healy would have to sign it. And Richard, there might even be some legal challenges to it after that.
Yeah, I mean, based upon the reaction I saw in the Globe with the Senate president and the House, that kind of gave some, skeptical comments, and even Governor Healy gave some skeptical comments. And it's going to be, obviously huge lobbying against it by Greater Boston Legal's real estate board and all the property owners. I mean, I think she's going to have a very tough time to get it through the state legislature, because I think, she'll get the Boston votes in Somerville and Cambridge, but a lot of the, outer folks are worried that it's going to set a precedent, and then, bleed off into other municipalities. Not to say, but I could be wrong.
Well, you have an overwhelmingly Democratic legislature in both the House and Senate by about a margin of 4-1. There's a lot of folks in Western and Central Massachusetts who are fairly progressive. So we'll have to see. It's a campaign promise.
Yeah.
It looks as if she's going to try to get it through. JJ?
Well, and she ran on this, so if people voted for her, then the problem is with the people wanting more government. So that's where we have to start.
All right. Thanks, JJ.
guys.
Thank you much.
All right,
Appreciate it. Let me get one more in here, if I can, real quickly. Chris in Boston. Chris, we have about a minute for you. What can you do with it?
So it asks, can rent control happen in Boston? The answer is apps.
Yes, very quickly. If somebody owns a building, they got to pay a mortgage, they got to pay taxes, which is sky high for everything. What the mayor should do is just build more buildings for people with low income and housing.
Okay, fair enough.
That's attacking the supply side. We didn't even get to that, but that is, yes, absolutely, that is the solution.
We'll see. We will see. Jim, I appreciate your call very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Those are 2 quick calls at the end. Richard, how can folks get in touch with your law office, if they're so inclined?
Yeah, you can check out my blog, massrealestatelablog.com. I'm on Twitter as well, Richard Betstein. Email is rvetstein@vetsteinlawgroup.com. And it's been a pleasure being on. Again, I do landlord-tenant, real estate litigation, just all sorts of stuff regarding property.
All right, Richard, and the last name is spelled Vetstein.
Correct.
Richard Betstein. Thanks, Richard. We'll keep in touch on this, okay?
Yep, hope to weigh in on that tax lien case. That'd be fun.
Yeah, that's I don't have the date on that, but we certainly follow us. You keep in touch with us, and we'll let you know. Thank you much. Appreciate it.
Will do. All right.
All right, we come back and talk about your favorite Hollywood actor,